It's raining again tonight, the soft, steady kind of rain that taps against the bakery windows like a friend asking to come in out of the cold. I don't mind it. I never have. Rain nights are my favorite nights. I help my grandmother run our little bakery here in the valley. It's small, just one narrow shopfront with a green awning, a few wooden tables, and a stone oven so old that Grandma says it was already old when she was young. But for as long as anyone in this town can remember, this has been the place people come for bread. 3 generations of the same family, 3 generations of the same oven, the same low hum of the wood settling as it burns down to embers. My favorite hours are these, long after we've flipped the sign to closed, after the last customer has gone home with a warm loaf tucked under their coat. The shop empties out. The lights dim to just the amber glow of one hanging lantern, and it's just me, the quiet, and the dough. I like to prepare tomorrow's dough at this hour, when the whole town is asleep. I roll up my sleeves, dust the counter with flour, and let my hands fall into the same motions Grandma taught me years ago. The oven ticks and creaks as it cools. Somewhere outside, the rain finds a gutter to drum against. I put the kettle on, and while it warms, I just breathe it all in. Yeast, wet stone, cinnamon dust still clinging to the air from this afternoon's rolls. It's peaceful in a way that's hard to explain, unless you felt it yourself. Like the whole world has quietly agreed to slow down, just for a few hours, just for me. I had no idea back then that this same quiet ritual, the one I loved simply because it felt nice, was about to become the answer to a mystery that would confuse an entire company. It started on an ordinary gray Tuesday. I remember because Grandma had just pulled a tray of rye loaves from the oven, and I was arranging them in the window when I saw the delivery trucks. Across the street, where the old shoe repair shop used to be, a construction crew had been working for weeks behind tall, paper-covered windows. That morning, the paper came down. Golden Crust Bakery's asterisk. The sign was enormous, lit up even in the daytime, all brushed steel and glowing white light. Through the glass, I could see rows of gleaming, computerized ovens, each one with a little digital screen blinking numbers. Uniformed staff moved briskly behind a spotless counter. It looked less like a bakery and more like a laboratory that happened to sell bread. "Well," Grandma said, wiping her hands on her apron, not even looking up from her mixing bowl. "That's new." I found out more over the following weeks, mostly from Mrs. Halloway, who seemed to know everyone's business up and down the valley road. Golden Crust, it turned out, wasn't just opening another branch. They'd built an entirely new division around a line of smart ovens machines that could supposedly sense dough consistency and adjust themselves automatically. No baker required. Our valley had been chosen as their very first public test site, specifically because our little bakery had such a loyal following. If their machines could outbake us, head office back in the city would fund the technology nationwide. If not, the whole project would likely be shut down. It wasn't really about us at all, not at first. We were simply the toughest test they could find. That would have been easier to accept if they hadn't also gotten hold of our recipes. It didn't take long to figure out how. Danny, who'd worked our weekend shifts the year before, had left for a better paying job. And it turned out that better paying job was managing Golden Crust's new counter. He hadn't stolen anything exactly. He'd simply remembered the measurements he used to write down for us and repeated them for his new employer. Grandma wasn't even angry when she heard. He didn't take anything I wouldn't have handed him myself if he'd asked, she said. So there it was. Same flour supplier, Golden Crust, had switched to ours within the month. Same measurements, down to the gram. Same steps, same rise times on paper. And yet, within a week of opening, something odd began to happen. Customers came back. Again and again, they'd wander into Golden Crust out of curiosity, buy a loaf that looked, on paper, identical to ours, and then quietly return to us a day later, a little sheepish, asking for the real one. "It's not bad," Mrs. Halloway told me one evening, picking up her usual half-dozen rolls. "It's just flat somehow. Same recipe, but it doesn't taste the way yours does." I heard variations of that sentence a dozen times that month. Same ingredients, same steps, same supplier, and yet, somehow, never the same bread. Across the street, I noticed the manager. A tired-looking, sharply dressed man named Mr. Whitfield, standing in his own window some evenings, staring at our little shop with a look that wasn't quite anger. More like a man doing long division that refused to come out even. I didn't understand it either, not yet. But something told me the answer wasn't written down anywhere in Grandma's recipe book. Not in any way a machine could simply read. So I decided to look closer. Not at the ingredients. Everyone already had those. At Grandma herself. It became my quiet midnight project. Every night, once the shop was closed and the street outside had gone dark and glossy with rain, I'd brew a cup of chamomile tea, pull Grandma's old recipe notebook down from its shelf above the oven, and read it page by page under the lantern light. It started on the very first night. The notebook itself was a strange, wonderful thing. Its cover soft with age, held together with a rubber band. Its pages stained with decades of flour and butter fingerprints. But what struck me most was what wasn't written in it. There were no exact oven temperatures. No bake at 425 degrees F for 22 minutes. Just short, odd little notes squeezed into the margins. Things like wood was sweet tonight, or air felt heavy, dough slow. I closed the notebook that night more puzzled than when I'd opened it. A few nights later, I noticed the notes weren't scattered at random. They followed the same dates as older baking logs Grandma kept in a separate ledger. The one where she wrote down which loaves sold out fastest, and which came out slightly denser than usual. I lined the two books up side by side on the counter, and a pattern started to surface. The denser days always seemed to fall right after a note about heavy air or damp wood. It wasn't proof of anything yet, but it was the first thread I could actually pull on. The next piece arrived almost by accident. One rainy evening, I asked Grandma, half joking, whether she ever checked the weather forecast before baking. She laughed and said she hadn't owned a working radio in years. "Don't need one," she said, nodding toward the window. "The valley tells you itself, if you're paying attention." I didn't understand what she meant until I watched her, the following night, pause at the woodpile before selecting a log, turning two aside because they felt heavier than they looked, and choosing a lighter one instead. For a few days after that, I was almost certain I'd found the whole answer. I convinced myself it was the wood, that if golden crust simply matched our kindling, the mystery would be solved. I even said so to Grandma one evening, rather proud of myself. She only smiled and shook her head. "The wood matters," she said, "but it's not the whole of it. If it were only the wood, I could write it down in one line, and you wouldn't need to sit up with me at all." I felt a little foolish, but she was right. A few nights later, I was sure I'd cracked it for good this time. Surely it was the humidity, the way the valley air thickened before a storm. But that turned out to be only half the truth as well. Some nights the air hung heavy, and the bread still rose beautifully, because the wind had shifted just enough to counter it, or the wood had dried a little more than expected. It wasn't one variable I was chasing. It was all of them, weighed against each other differently every single night. The last piece was the one that finally tied everything together. I stayed up with her one full night, tea in hand, just watching. I watched her adjust the oven door by the smell of the smoke. I watched her let one batch of dough rest 10 extra minutes by the drafty window instead of near the oven, because, she said, it needs the cool tonight, not the warmth. I watched her cover the starter twice instead of once, murmuring something about the wind having shifted from the east. Piece by piece, over 4 separate nights, I realized what I was actually looking at. It wasn't a recipe book at all. It was a weather journal in disguise, 50 years of quietly tracking humidity, wind direction, and the dampness of the firewood, and adjusting in small, almost invisible ways, night after night. A little more rest time on a damp evening. A little less heat when the wood burned dry and hot. A cover over the starter when the wind carried a new chill through the old window frames. Golden Crust's machines, I realized, weren't blind at all. Their sensors really could measure oven temperature down to the degree, track humidity, even log the moisture in a fresh delivery of wood. The numbers they collected every night were probably more precise than anything Grandma had ever written down. What they didn't have was someone standing over those numbers who'd spent 50 years learning what they actually meant. Someone who could look at 3 different readings at once and simply know, the way Grandma always somehow did, that tonight called for 10 extra minutes by the window instead of the oven. The machines could gather the evidence. They just had no one experienced enough to read it. I sat back in my chair that final night, tea gone lukewarm in my hands, and laughed softly to myself. The secret ingredient wasn't a secret at all. It was attention. Decades of quiet, patient, midnight attention, and no two nights ever quite the same. Even after 50 years, Grandma said, catching my expression and smiling. The bread still surprises me sometimes. That's rather the point of it. About a week after I'd finally pieced it all together, there was a soft knock on the shop's glass door, long after closing. Through the rain-speckled window, I saw Mr. Whitfield standing under a black umbrella, his coat collar turned up against the chill. I let him in. Grandma, seated near the oven with her own cup of tea, simply gestured for him to take a seat, as if she'd been expecting him. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He looked, honestly, like a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks. "I'll be straightforward with you both," he said, folding his umbrella and setting it carefully by the door. "We've matched your flour, your measurements. We even installed a humidity sensor in every one of our ovens, syncing them to the weather station 2 towns over. Our food scientists ran the numbers a dozen different ways. I genuinely don't understand it." I believed him. He didn't sound like a man who'd been lazy or careless. He sounded like a man who'd tried everything reasonable and was still standing in the rain, confused. He slid a folded piece of paper across the counter, an offer to license Grandma's recipe outright, generous on paper. He mentioned, gently but plainly, that if this pilot program failed, the whole automated oven division would likely be shut down, and dozens of people back at head office would lose their jobs over it. It wasn't a threat. It sounded, if anything, like a man asking for help. There was a long pause. The oven ticked softly as it cooled. Outside, the rain kept its steady rhythm. Grandma didn't raise her voice. She never does. She simply reached over, patted the old notebook sitting on the counter between them, and smiled. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "you're welcome to copy every page in this book, word for word, if you like. I don't think it will change a thing." He blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. "Why not?" "Because," Grandma said, "what's written in there isn't a recipe. It's 50 years of standing in this kitchen, listening to this oven, and paying attention to this valley's weather. Your sensors aren't wrong, Mr. Whitfield. They're probably more accurate than my own 2 eyes. But numbers only tell you what happened. They don't tell you what to do about it, not unless you've stood here long enough to know. That part, your machines can help with. They just can't do it for you." He was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the notebook without touching it. "So the technology isn't the problem." "No," Grandma said gently. "The problem is you built the ovens before you grew the baker." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. Then, almost hesitantly, as he gathered his umbrella to leave, he asked one more thing. "Would you ever consider teaching this properly? Not to us, to anyone who wanted to learn." It wasn't a question either of us expected. Grandma didn't answer right away. She only said she'd think about it and saw him to the door. He left that night without a clear answer from her. Not angry, just thoughtful, the umbrella opening again as he stepped back out into the rain. Grandma and I talked about it over breakfast the next morning. The shop still quiet. The smell of the first loaves just beginning to fill the room. He asked me something last night I can't quite stop thinking about, Grandma said, stirring her tea slowly. Whether I'd ever teach this properly to anyone who wanted to learn. And what did you tell him? Nothing yet. She was quiet for a moment. But I think the answer is yes. He didn't ask like a man trying to win something. He asked like someone who actually wanted to understand. So instead of guarding the secret, we did the opposite. We put up a small handwritten sign in the window. Free midnight baking class. Every Friday night. Everyone welcome. At first, only a handful of neighbors showed up, curious more than anything. But word spread quickly through the valley. Soon, our little kitchen was filled every Friday evening with townspeople of all ages, sleeves rolled up, flour dusted across the counters. All of us gathered close to the old stone oven. We taught them to feel the dampness of the dough between their fingers, to listen for the particular crackle of well-seasoned wood versus wet, stubborn logs, to notice the way Grandma always had, how the air itself changes on a rainy night, and how good bread simply asks you to notice it too. To my surprise, Mr. Whitfield showed up to the third class, out of uniform, sitting quietly near the back with flour already dusted on his sleeves before anyone had even started. He didn't say much. He just watched and listened and tried clumsily at first to feel the dough the way Grandma described it. Golden Crust's pilot program didn't survive much longer after that. The numbers simply hadn't improved enough, and head office made their decision to shut it down. The ovens themselves, Whitfield told me later, weren't scrapped. They found a quieter life eventually, sold off to smaller bakeries as an aid for experienced hands rather than a replacement for them. Tools that were only ever as good as the baker reading their numbers. But before the branch closed, Whitfield came by one last time, not in his uniform, just in a raincoat, holding a small paper bag. My own bread, he said a little sheepishly, setting the bag on the counter. Rye, you're rye if I'm honest, but I baked it myself last night in my own kitchen. I paid attention to the wood the way you showed us. It's not as good as yours, not yet. Grandma tasted a slice, chewed thoughtfully, and smiled. It's better than it should be for a first try. Tonight, the bakery is quiet again, the way I love it best. The rain is falling steady outside, blurring the streetlights into soft golden smudges through the window. The oven has cooled to its familiar gentle tick, and the whole shop smells faintly of rye and cinnamon and warm, settled stone. I sit at the counter with my tea, Grandma's old notebook, open in front of me. its pages soft and worn under the lantern light. I add a small note of my own tonight in the space at the bottom of a page. Something about tonight's rain and how it made the dough rise just a little slower than usual. It feels good, adding to something so much bigger than myself. A small, quiet thread in a very long, very warm story, one that, as it turns out, even a stranger from across the street eventually found his way into. Outside, the rain keeps its gentle rhythm against the glass. Inside, the bread rests, rising slowly in the dark, exactly the way it's supposed to. Some things were simply never meant to be copied, only learned, one quiet night at a time. Good night,